Welcome to Redirect, Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins, joined shortly by co-host and fellow immigration attorney Matthew Archambault. This week we're talking to Luis Cortes. We're talking about the DACA case that's coming up before the Supreme Court. And you might want to know a little bit about that case and what's going on. And you might also, I think there's a little bit of inspiration at the end, hopefully. Encouraging people to get involved, to find a protest or start one on your own, or get involved in a campaign or push an existing candidate who you're unsure about on the issue of immigration. It's really important. Luis reminds us, I guess spoiler alert, hashtag spoiler alert, reminds us that DACA didn't come out of thin air and it wasn't an act of sort of administrative benevolence. It was fought for by real people. And so people need to take initiative and realize that they've got the power to organize and make change. So if you like the show, you can subscribe on iTunes, leave a review, say something nice. You can become a patron at patreon.com/redirect. Appreciate all the support, all our fans, all the listeners. Enjoy the conversation this week with Matthew and Luis. So he says, mental illness is deeply stigmatized in Mexico, and it reaches up through the government and manifests itself in government choices about healthcare and non-intervention in conditions of institutions.
Well, that's great. You're doing well. Great. You could have wrote that.
Also, no social distinction. Society doesn't recognize the group as existing.
It seems to be kind of the opposite of what he had previously stated.
Right. It does seem like that.
So how long has your guy been in jail now?
Over 3 years.
So you have an appeal that the BIA will probably, not do much with. Mm-hmm. But that will take at least, 6 months for detained appeals. Then you can go back to the Ninth Circuit.
Mm-hmm.
So your guy is looking at least another year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's fair.
Yeah, it seems super fair.
Don't you wish you could just tell the BIA that's okay?
Can I skip you?
We understand your position. That's fine.
Like, I could file a really good brief and then just put also, here's a motion for you to just summary reaffirm the judge's decision, since that's what you're going to do anyways. The part about it's not immutable. So he says the social group involved lack of family support, psychosis, and indigence. And he's like, indigence, it's not defined in the record. What does that mean? Well, the record shows that they have literally no money.
So you have to start defining words. Do you have to print out the Webster's dictionary version of indigent?
Right.
You should have used super really poor so you would understand.
We had an expert who testified specifically about the type of family support that would matter. Family with education, family with financial stability, with some sort of well-paying job or that sort of thing. And so then he says, well, family support, that's totally undefined, and we have no idea what that means. Which, again, is just, not true. Family
support, would that be support or help or aid from someone who's family to you?
I guess, right? I don't know. It's
someone who has a blood relationship with you. But, those are just, nonsensical arguments, right?
Okay, here's the thing, though. If you had a social group for asylum, where part of it was lack of family support, but then the guy did have some family in Mexico, let's say. And if you left the record to be really unclear, to what extent he could have a place to live or whatever, then maybe he would have a point. But in this case, he's got his parents who are undocumented and they live in the United States. He has literally no family in Mexico. And in closing, I reiterated the fact that even if his parents relocated, his parents live check to check doing farm work. They're in their late 50s, so the extent to which they can continue that lifestyle for much longer is in question, and they don't have any education. So it overlays perfectly with what the expert testified to, which is in order to have meaningful family support in Mexico, you need family that has education, that has financial stability, and these sorts of things. And they
has means, right?
Right. Means, right. So it's not like we left it totally unclear or not well defined. But the worst part of the decision is this whole thing about schizophrenia and psychosis not being immutable because people try to treat it. It just doesn't. It's very frustrating. Can you tell I'm frustrated?
Well, how does your client feel?
I mean, he's down to appeal. He wants to get out, obviously. So,
I'm sure he has super dangerous crimes that keep him from getting out, too.
well, this is the weird thing about his bond history with the same judge. He has, I think, like a negligent driving and a drug possession. And the judge found that he wasn't a danger.
Good.
But that he's a flight risk.
Mm-hmm.
And I argued in court and also before the board on an appeal that this guy doesn't have the mental capacity or the skills to flee. He doesn't have anywhere to go. His doctors, his therapists, everybody, his 2 family members in the whole world live in this one community. And they're like, no, he's a total flight risk. It doesn't make sense. I'm going to do a habeas, I decided.
Well, look at you. Fancy.
Matthew, you were saying that today is the 1-year anniversary of our Alyssa Milano episode.
The one that blew up,
and
that put us right on track in the forefront of podcast mania.
Yeah, you and I both, we had high expectations for what was going to happen with the podcast after that. Bought new
so
house,
many tweets from her about it.
took out new mortgages, and it turns out that was a huge mistake.
Yeah. She didn't tweet us once, right?
Around that time, she was doing a lot of interviews, lots of different shows and things.
Mm-hmm.
And she was tweeting about them, like, constantly.
Yeah, we're not talking like the Tonight Show or like
No.
Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, she might have been on those shows too.
It was like, I was on Bill's Basement podcast.
Yeah.
Talk about my favorite Who's the Boss rerun or whatever.
I was at the Central Square Mall and I spoke to a couple children who were carrying a balloon.
Yeah, and they recorded it. Here's a link to their Periscope.
It's on TikTok.
You know, I thought we had a good interview, and we tweeted it out, and we sent them a link, and nothing. So,
yeah, you don't hear much from her anymore. So, you know.
Yeah, I think she got in some, you know how leftist Twitter is, right? There's a lot of purity testing going on.
Yeah, did she run afoul?
They get very defensive about purity testing accusations that they're engaged in purity testing.
They kind of are.
She came out with some praise of Joe Biden. I think she said something like, look, people, the main thing is beating Trump. So she's making an electability argument early in the campaign. And she said Joe Biden was the most electable. And of course, that's wrong, but it upset a lot of people. So,
yeah.
Anyways. Matthew, I'm having dinner tonight with Charles Cook. He's coming.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's going to be crazy.
And it happens to be his birthday. So
I've been on his show before, his podcast. Have you?
He's invited me on his show in the way that you invite somebody to do something that you don't really ever want them to do.
That was probably how he invited me, but I said yes.
When you're like, hey, we should totally get together sometime. And you just kind of leave it.
And then you go to San Francisco and that guy is there waiting for you. Like, awkward was that?
Yeah, super awkward. So let's see. I wanted to talk to you about a couple stories since I don't know what's going on with Luis. I mean, he's one of these millennials. He should know how to work a computer.
No, his whole thing is like he's super busy, but you know he's like taking a nap or something.
Oh, totally.
Or he's in Seattle, right? So he's at a Starbucks or something. Isn't that what they do?
Just like you and I, we've told our staff, like, don't bother me. I'm briefing a Ninth Circuit thing.
Yeah.
And then we go in and we make jokes on a podcast. Yeah. All right. So this is a story. Some immigration judges say they rule a certain way to avoid firing, which is exactly what you want from somebody who's a judge, right?
You know, it's funny. I just saw the headline because I don't need to read more to understand what it says. So I've noticed in Philadelphia, the 2 judges who are probably the kindest or whatnot, they seem to have the largest masters. This one judge, he had over 130 people for his master. And the judges who are maybe a little bit more strict, their masters are not all that, not as many people. And I noticed that up in Newark as well.
What is the conspiracy theory here?
They're just like torturing these judges.
All right. Well, here's what the article says. Some immigration judges hearing cases at the U.S.-Mexico border have confided to their fellow jurists They have issued decisions on an immigrant's ability to enter or stay in the United States based on whether the decision would get them fired. Ashley Tabador, president of the National Association of Immigration Judges, disclosed this detail during a September 27th panel discussion on sweeping changes in the nation's immigration courts enacted by the Federal Department of Justice, which oversees the judges' work. Tabador said the Justice Department, since the start of the Trump administration, has begun to, quote, micromanage the immigration judges' dockets, telling judges, quote, these cases are not yours, leading to sudden swaps of hundreds of cases from one judge's docket to another. Judges are now given 60 or 80 cases in one docket, with refugee and asylum claims hailing from not only Spanish-speaking Latin America, but other countries as well, according to Tabador. Sometimes there was just one interpreter assigned to the docket despite the variety of languages petitioners speak, she added. Sometimes there are none. And despite hiring additional judges to handle the caseload, there are about 150 more judges now than 5 years ago. Tabador said the case backlog has now passed the 1 million mark. So, according to this article, it sounds like there could be something to your little conspiracy theory, the idea that they're just sort of shuffling cases around and saying, oh yeah, these aren't yours anymore. They're going over here.
This is like the least surprising bit of news that we've broke on this podcast ever. When you look at new judges, they have a 2-year probationary period. And those are the ones that always kind of, I think, worry us the most, right? Because they're obviously concerned. I mean, they just became judges. I'm sure they don't want to get fired,
right?
Within 2 years. So, it's got to be hard to be a judge. I don't know why anyone would choose to be a judge right now, why they would choose like, okay, now is the time to become an immigration judge. Because even if you kind of like it, like you're more of the government side, they're just so micromanaged. I'm guessing they had more freedom as a TA, as a regular trial attorney.
Right. Yeah. Hey, look who figured out how to use a computer. All right. So mid-conversation, Luis Cortes is joining us. We're going to just wrap up this article. Luis, we're talking about this article. Some immigration judges say they rule a certain way to avoid firing. Did you see this article?
Oh, no. Yeah. Who's reporting this?
Well, this was...
The fake news media?
The fake news media. This is Crux. It's the Catholic News Service. But apparently the president of the National Association of Immigration Judges, Ashley Tabador, said this at a September 27th panel discussion. So it's pretty good sourcing here. Have you ever had a judge issue a decision that you thought was rendered so that they could not be fired?
So they could not be fired. I just had a recent hearing in Denver, actually, where the legal premise on the social group on the asylum was somewhat tenuous after some of the case law changed, but we thought that we were going to get cat pretty certainly. And the judge really went out of his way to deny cat, saying that the Mexican government was going to be able to protect him if he's returned. And keep in mind that everybody agreed that this person had been horrendously harmed in the past by a person that both the U.S. government wants and he's kind of wanted abroad. But our client, because he didn't report a police report to the municipality police, then it all kind of comes tumbling down. And it really seemed like he was trying to kind of just deny the case to, at a very limited view as to who deserves asylum. So, there are cases like that where I don't necessarily think it's about my client specifically, but I think they're going along with this limited resource that asylum has become to be.
Right. I assume we all heard, because I've heard it. Judges now saying, well, I'm not going to be able to grant this case under current law, or I'm not so sure about these social groups, and you understand somewhat what they're saying. They're we have a change in the law. There's all these new things, but I think we touched on it before here, matter of AB, which talks about basically domestic violence and private acts of persecution. The case does not say that those cases can't be granted, but you have judges who will flat out say, I can't grant this type of case. I can't grant a domestic violence case. And it's but why? I don't know if it's always because that's the way they view the law as well, or because of pressure from above. And there's probably some of both, right?
Right. The article goes on to say that judges are being assigned to these tent courts along the border, which is a real cool system we have. So they're forced to put these cases on hold that maybe they've been hearing for years to go down to do tent court. The National Association of Immigration Judges has asked Congress to confer the same status to federal immigration courts as it has to bankruptcy court and tax court. And people who are listening who are non-lawyers might be surprised to find out that immigration court looks like a court, and there's a thing called a judge, and they wear robes. There's a bench and all that stuff. But they're actually DOJ employees. They're not technically judges. There's really no independence. And so it is a weird situation that the prosecutor and the judge are both sort of under the guise of the DOJ, which creates an interesting conflict.
Well, I don't think that's technically correct, right? Because Department of Homeland Security is the one that employs the trial attorneys. However, I even think we saw under Obama where Department of Justice, what they wanted to do with the DACA and all that was supported by the Department of Homeland Security Council. And I think it's even more clear now that there is one direction coming from the top. And though it might be going through two different agencies, it's the same direction. So,
right. So, yeah, pretty cool story. We wanted to talk to you, Luis, though, because we have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
You have DACA, and I think the pressing question is, if you've been here so long, why haven't you gotten in line yet? Have we done that joke with you already before?
I think that's number 5.
I think every time you're
on.
We
just have the producer go back and get Luis's responses before.
No, but seriously, since you've last been on, a lot of time has gone by, and it seems like the last time you were on, you hadn't gone down to get your papers. Is there a reason why that still isn't the case?
Well, I think it reaches a fundamental problem that no one is really talking about, which is that the line is really long and they don't provide porta potties midway through the line. So I have to keep getting out of the line to go to the bathroom. Then I'm back at the back of the line.
No one saves your space.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big problem.
Right. People get all up in arms when I try to go back in. It's
awesome. I go because I don't need to be in a line because I'm a true American. Mm-hmm. So I go on really hot days with bottles of water. You can sell them for $5 or $6. And then the trick is you go back with a bigger bottle of empty water to sell for $10 so they can pee in that and they don't have to get out of line.
This is such a weird fantasy of yours. All right. So, Luis, you are, for people who don't know, I think we did a couple of months ago, a 2-parter on your story as a DACA recipient and a lawyer and somebody with a really interesting story. And so people should go back and check that out. But you're also involved with the DACA case that's coming before the Supreme Court. So tell people a little bit about what's going on with that case right now.
The case right now is scheduled for oral arguments on November 12th. And so the parties it's a West Coast and East Coast party that were joined together. So the West Coast case came from our case where we represent the 6 individual DACA plaintiffs that effectively represent the cross-section of the DACA recipients, and the state of California and the UC regions that represent the University System of California, right? The University of California system, which, by the way, is where now Jenna Napolitano is employed. She's the president of the UC regions, and she's the one who came out with DACA. So there's that weird kind of phenomenon at play. And there are 2 sets of East Coast parties. The NAACP, they sued as a institutional plaintiff, and then there is one DACA recipient that was sued, and then, they have some other people joining them. But anyway, those cases were consolidated and they're now at the Supreme Court. And so our briefs were filed a few days ago responding to the government's petition, right, that of their arguments. And as of today is the deadline for amicus to submit their briefing. And so we're getting a ton of support. Earlier this week, Tim Cook, the founder of CEO, submitted his brief, and maybe an hour or so ago, the university submitted their brief collectively. And so we expect to see much more briefs coming in. I think there was a conglomerate of companies like Amazon and Microsoft and a whole other kind of Fortune 500 companies also submitting their brief. So it's been a big collective push to make sure that the Supreme Court looks at all the contours of this case and realizes what's at stake and what the impact it will have, not just for the individual DACA recipients, but for their families, for the community, for the economy, for the universities. But it also really comes down to like a very technical legal question about presidential authority, the manner in which the president can proceed on these kind of actions. And I think looking at the broader picture, and one of the things that is very delicate here is this balance that we have in the argument of how do we argue that President Obama had the authority to, announce this, or the secretary at the time had the opportunity to announce this, but the way in which President Trump took away DACA is not lawful. And how do we preserve the presidential authority for future administrations? If there's a change in administrations coming the 2020 election, then, we want to make sure that we don't bind the next administration's hands and wanted to have like a DACA 2.0 or, whatever.
Luis, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You mentioned all those people doing the amicus and all that, and that sounded a lot like policy, like why having DACA is a good idea. And you said that there's a disbalance. But do you worry that they're going to look at it as you guys are really making a policy argument, and because your legal argument is not all that sound?
We were very intentional about who was going to say what and who was going to bring a point across. And so, one of the things that happens with appellate writing is that you have a limited number of pages, right, that we have to kind of work with. And the question is, how do we use our real estate in that sense effectively? And so when we were thinking about, how do we really hone in, or how do we really tell the stories about the people who benefited from DACA and all the great that has happened, it's been an unqualified success. We really leaned on amicus to be able to make those arguments. Our brief, the brief we submitted, does rest upon a more technical legal argument about why it is that, one, President Obama and his administration had the authority to do this, while at the same time, the way in which President Trump's administration decided to end DACA.
But there is no argument that DACA could be ended, right?
Yeah.
By President Trump or President Biden or whatnot. You're just saying that the way they went about it, just like, I guess, the argument for DAPA, why DAPA didn't succeed because of the way he went about it.
That's right. And, it reminds me a bit of the travel ban, where they had different reiterations about it. But here's kind of what it comes down to when we're kind of just filtering it down to its core level. The decision to end DACA, it wasn't necessarily a decision to rescind the policy. It really kind of comes across as a new policy in and of itself. It's all premised on this concept that they couldn't do it. Right? They're bound to end it. They have to end it. And it's rooted because, the Texas court and the Fifth Circuit into the DAPA case had a lot to say about DAPA and, its legality. And then the Supreme Court affirmed it in an evenly split court. And so the administration used that to say, listen, we have to end it. And then since then, they've had different reiterations as to why they were ending it. But it was all coming down to we have no choice. We have to end it. And it really shifts the political accountability to the courts, right? Essentially, what President Trump is doing is he's saying, the courts have told me I can't have DACA because it's illegal. Right, courts, right? Isn't that what you're saying? And so they're forcing now the courts to answer this question. I think it would be entirely lawful for President Trump to say, you know what, DACA, I don't want these people here, and I don't think it's a good policy choice, so I'm going to end it. And I think that would be much harder to get around. But
so if President Trump came to you and said, Luis, I'll help you out with your papers. I just need you as a point man and how I can legally get rid of DACA.
Yeah.
And then we can make a deal. I know he listens. We can get you a job.
He's a big fan.
Maybe we could have a cubicle next to Stephen Miller. Should we explore that more for you, or just let me know? You can text me off air.
Yeah. So, the answer to that would be essentially he could just say listen, I want to end it because I don't like it. I just want to end it.
Don't you think they realize that? Or What do you think their political game is?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold. One, I mean, I think they've dug their heels in quite a bit so that, they would have to come to the court now and say, well, listen, we just want to end it. The whole argument that we've been doing that it was unlawful, kind of just put that aside. I think the key difference here is that the political accountability of it. President Trump would have to own it on his own, and his administration would have to own it, saying that we want to end DACA. And as we have seen, at least with some of these kind of inhumane immigration policies, like the child separation and that kind of thing, there was a lot of rhetoric of this is the Democrats' law, the Democrats could take it away if they wanted to. There's a lot of that shifting of the blame that was happening to try to kind of keep it at arm's length. And then he created this problem and then signed an executive order ending it, and so he would have to own this kind of political accountability of, I want to end DACA as part of my administration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this administration is aware of the pretty significant backlash that would come from that. Because what's interesting about DACA is that although there are people who are against it for a variety of reasons, the stats show that a majority amount of the population in the U.S. really does support DACA.
It's interesting.
An overwhelming majority.
It's interesting that you still think that Trump would have to own something and that he's bound to some sort of sense of reality. I mean, I get what you're saying, that if the Supreme Court comes out and says, no, actually, it was proper for Obama to do it, and so this argument just doesn't stand up, that technically in some world where facts matter puts the president into a rhetorical box. But he's going around saying that Russia was set up by Ukraine, and he just lives in his own special right-wing bubble. So
yeah, and I think the other thing that the Department of Justice is going to have to answer to is that they've said that one of the reasons that this is unlawful was because DACA is supposed to be a deferred action is supposed to be a version of prosecutorial discretion, which should be done on a case-by-case basis, and that DACA effectively is a categorical rule rather than a discretionary case-by-case rule, and that discretionary decisions cannot be subject to a flat rule policy or, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But in the asylum case, right, the asylum ban case, they came back and said that because asylum is discretionary, that DOJ and DHS is permitted to make categorical rules on their discretion. And so now they're saying that forms of relief that are discretionary are subject to categorical rules, and then they're saying that they're not subject to categorical rules, and it's really an opposite. I mean, we've looked at
but those are different cases, Luis. They're different cases.
Oh,
they're different cases. You can't expect to hold the government to one logical argument in two completely different cases about executive power.
Right. Yeah, and I think that.
Yeah, see, I just blew your mind.
I think the dynamic that we're inching closer to with these kind of inopposite policies is that we're inching closer to the census case, where, in the census case, the government was saying that they needed the citizenship question in the census for one reason, and then it turns out that they didn't lie so well. And we do know that Chief Justice Roberts, he was ready to rule on the side of the government in the census case until the memorandum came out saying, actually, there's all these underlying reasons as to why they wanted the citizenship question that had to do with gerrymandering and that kind of thing, and then changed his decision kind of last minute. And, for people who've read the census case, it does read that way because there's a lot of dicta there by Chief Justice Roberts where it talks about the executive power and the authority to do this. And then it kind of does a quick shift and says, yeah, but you guys were caught in this lie.
Your dog whistle got too loud.
Yeah.
It became a human whistle.
We can't ignore, and the government can't ignore that that's in the backdrop of this case, where there's some level of incredulity by the court as to why the government is doing what they're doing and the reasons that they're setting forth with what the real reasons are.
But we all know the real reason, right? I mean, we all get what the real reason is. We do, right? In all these cases.
Well, because people need to get in line.
Luis is not going to get up in front of the Supreme Court and argue it. But really, it kind of comes down to racism, bigotry, and then everything is kind of spreads from there. I know that probably doesn't work its way into legal briefs, but it's kind of the root, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, we wholeheartedly agree. And it's something that we argued at the district court and the Ninth Circuit, where we discussed kind of what was said about the recipients who ultimately get DACA, right? Like DACA is statistically, according to USCIS statistics, DACA is received 99% by Mexican and Central American countries. Then there's the 1% who are from other countries. And so given the rhetoric that was said before and after the campaign, we made that note, and it was part of our constitutional claims that one of the reasons that DACA was ended was due to racial animus. But the travel ban case largely limited how campaign speech could be used to then determine animus for later policies. And on a legal front, we were shut down, and that question is not before the Supreme Court, but we tried to shout it as loud as we can. And I think, that's one of the things that stood us out from the rest of the institutional plaintiffs, was that we had the stronger standing to be able to make that argument. One of the things that I think happened in the beginning of this case was that, especially because, it's California, there's a lot of sentiment around liberal California, right? And the Ninth Circuit. And so President Trump had a lot to say about that, about the Ninth Circuit. So we were aware that this was largely seen as this like liberal issue. And, Jenna Napolitano is also involved in the litigation as she's the president of the UC Regents. And so, we were aware that there was, it seemed like Obama era administration plus liberal California on the liberal Ninth Circuit is kind of bringing this case. And very recently, we were very excited when Ted Olson, the former Solicitor General for George Bush, and also used to work at the administration for Ronald Reagan, and was, the counsel for George Bush during Bush versus Gore, where we collaborated with him in order to have him join our fight. He was very involved in the brief writing, and I was able to meet Ted, and he's a very lovely person, very, very smart, as you, I'm sure, are aware. But what that really signals is that this issue, both from a technical legal issue and a humanitarian issue, isn't a Republican, Democratic, liberal, conservative issue. There's an issue about how the executive exercises its authority to make sure that there's political accountability, the things that they can rely on as an administration, the thing that agencies can do and not do when they set a memo. And so I think what seems to be crossing these political lines is that the way that this whole thing went about is wrong. No way which way you're looking at it, from a policy perspective or a technical legal perspective. And so we're hoping that that really resonates with the justices, not so much the political ideologies, but that we're trying to make sure that we communicate to the court that this is more than just a political issue. It's just wrong on every front.
Right. Now, if things don't go your way and DACA is ended forever and thousands of lives are destroyed, I'm curious how much of the blame pie, we take the blame pie, cut it into slices and assign it to different people involved, how much of it is yours?
I mean, that's what keeps me up at night, right? Like when we're working on these briefs, and we know that any kind of phrase can kind of derail the ship even by 1 degree, and that sets it off on a completely different course. So all of that to say that if this doesn't work out, then I would like to take this opportunity to apologize to 800,000 people.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I'm glad.
Don't forget their families. So it's a little
and
bit
the families
more.
and their employers.
Oh, yeah. I mean, really, if we're talking just pure numbers, it goes way beyond 800,000.
So when is the oral argument?
So the oral argument is on November 12th. And interestingly enough, we don't know exactly what the oral argument is going to look like, because the state of Texas has filed in the Supreme Court. They asked for permission from the court to participate in the oral argument, even though they're not a party to it. This whole fight so far has been about why the decision to end DACA was unlawful. Well, they then brought a very late suit in Texas about why DACA is unlawful, right? As opposed to why the rescission of DACA was unlawful. And that was kind of what the DAPA litigation was about. So they are trailblazing that lone fight, and they have asked the Supreme Court to participate. So the Supreme Court is going to make a decision whether, one, they should participate, and two, we presume that it's going to be on the side of the Department of Justice. But then there's a whole issue of timing, right? Because right now they gave a half hour per side. And so does that come from that half hour? Do they extend the time? So that's like kind of up in the air to try to figure out. But we know it's November 12th. And from what I understand about going to see the argument, it doesn't get streamed, right? Like the Supreme Court is one of the very few courts that doesn't allow video stream. I'm unsure whether they will audio stream it the day of. I kind of think that they won't. And trying to go see it, I know that they give out tickets of some sort the day of the hearing. But my understanding is that people sometimes camp outside it, like trying to get concert tickets.
Right.
So do you get like your own like set of tickets, like for family and friends?
Yeah. Why can't you call Tim Apple and, Tim Apple has to be able to get tickets to this thing.
Bruh, give me some of your tickets, man. I know you're not going to need all of them.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. I also heard that, and again, like I'm an outsider to the Supreme Court bar, right? To that extent. And so I don't know how it all works, but I also became aware that it sounds like there's a whole business behind this where you could pay people to stand in line for you. And that way you could just kind of come in and swoop last minute.
Nice.
So there's that.
Well.
So how long after the oral argument would they expect a decision?
As we're having conversations, we're anticipating maybe sometime in April is when we would get a decision, though we also do know that the way in which the DACA case was picked up and handled by the Supreme Court is very unorthodox. They sat on the petition for writ of cert for a long time, and they waited until literally the last day on a Friday that they could do it. And statistically, that has never happened. So we didn't even think it was going to be heard by this term when they usually pick up cases, and it wasn't picked up. We're like, oh, okay, it's going to just be carried over. And then the briefing was done really quickly. The argument was set really quickly. And so right now we anticipate April, but it could be a little sooner. But I think we're all kind of anticipating the April deadline, which means that for folks who have DACA, that they should try to renew now, because we can squeeze another 2 years out of DACA.
So optimistic. That's optimism right there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so, yeah.
I'm kind of advising my clients the same thing. Not that I don't believe in you, but
Right.
Look,
right.
I've talked to the guy who's working on this. You're going to want to renew right now. I know you've got a year and 11 months left on your card. And renewing now only gets you an extra couple of months. Hey, you know what? I think it's good advice, and I joke about blame and all that, but the truth of the matter is I couldn't choose a better person to be working on it, and you're so smart and honestly like such an inspiration as a lawyer, putting aside your background. But when knowing what you've been through and everything, that only helps.
And it's people like Luis, right, that make the argument so compelling.
Right. Exactly. But also, I have to speak up for the non-lawyer DACAs. Most of my clients are busting their ass in the field or doing whatever. And those people are also inspirations. And again, I don't mean to put too fine a point on the pressure, but it's kind of like you get a free throw to win a game and you got to send the best shooter to the line. And I personally am glad that it's you. And I know you're not working on it alone, but we love and appreciate you. So
yeah, and even just think, when did the litigation start?
We filed the week that they rescinded DACA. So it was rescinded on a Monday, September 2017.
Right. So even the worst case scenario, you lose. That's another 2.5 years that has, really changed some people's lives. So sometimes in immigration, that's what we're playing for, right? We're kind of kicking the can down the road and hoping something better comes along.
There's a lot of controversy about this case, too, amongst pro-immigrant groups, too. And I think we might have talked about this before, where the stay that keeps DACA in place, there's not everybody was for it, because there's this argument about, if there's this like impending doom, that it will force Congress to act. That's having a lot of faith in the political branches, given that we did just recently go through.
No, that's being incredibly naive and it's borderline stupid. It's actually stupid. It's not borderline stupid. It's stupid to think that this president and this administration would be shamed into doing something. Seriously, we've had family separation. We have the complete bullshit in hell that is MPP, the Remain in Mexico program. We have farcical announcements that Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras are like safe third countries. And you think someone really thought that this administration would be shamed into doing a real DACA deal?
Yeah.
Get the out of here. Seriously.
I mean, I agree, and I think that's putting a lot of faith in something that has been demonstrated to not be working in its entirety. And I think, too, we have clients who have DACA who have a final order of removal. It's not like everyone is going to be placed in removal proceedings and have this kind of long trajectory. There will be people who will be deported within a matter of days if DACA is not kept in place. And they will lose their houses. They will lose their ability to be with their families. And it's a devastating loss to say, like, let's just allow people to start falling off the cliff to see if we will be saved en masse. I don't see why we can't do both. And I also agree that that's not the way to do it, because I know that my clients who have a final order of removal from when they were like 3 heavily depend on DACA for their well-being.
Right.
And I think, to Stephen and your point earlier, like oftentimes when I think about DACA, I think about Fight Club, where there's a scene in Fight Club where it's being revealed to a person about who is in Fight Club. And they're saying, we are
Spoiler
your
alert.
cooks, we are your, whatever. And they go through a list. And I think about that a lot, because I do think that there's a lot of DACA recipients who aren't comfortable coming out from their status, right? And decide to still keep that private. But the reality is that we are from your doctors, your lawyers, your nurses, your teachers, your counselors. We are your mechanics. We pick the food you eat and we take care of your kids. We clean up after you. We build your houses. We give you your loans. And we are the ones who are very much integrated into this community from every aspect of life.
Right.
And it can't be underscored enough. The Supreme Court, in multiple times throughout decades, have said that deportation will lead to the loss of what makes life worth living. And they've said it over and over again since like the 1920s. And it's been recognized, the severe punishment that deportation has on a person. And it can't be understated more with the DACA recipients. And not just DACA recipients, right? Like, I'm talking about people who came here as children, and not to otherize other immigrants, but that's what's at the forefront of the conversation. I think the others should be at the forefront of the conversation as well. And I think that DACA is a good spearhead to do that. I don't think that anybody should be excluded. We have adults who have been here longer than I've been alive, right? Even though they didn't come in as children. And they are worth counting too. But I think this starts the conversation in the right way. One last point I'll say about this, because I know that we're kind of talking about DACA. I think it's also important to remember, like, what brought about DACA. And this might be for like people who are thinking, like, how do I get involved? Like, what do I do? DACA came from non-lawyers. It came from non-lawyers and people getting involved and calling their congressional representatives, but also to a large degree, like activism. I can't underscore that enough about how big of a role activism came into play to push DACA. It really came from a bunch of young people who went in and sat down on President Obama's campaign office when he was campaigning for his reelection, and just sat there and sat there and sat there and sat there. And they said, if you're really about it, you were talking about this whole, felons not family and all that stuff. If you're really about it, we're going to sit here and have you do something. And these young people crafted what DACA is today. This wasn't drafted initially by, a legislative aide or, a White House aide or whatever. This was drafted by young people. And then there was a level of collaboration and deals that had to be made. And it ultimately, DACA came in its final form, but it came from that. And I think that also needs to be recognized. I think that President Obama gets too much credit sometimes about DACA. This was something he was forced to do. Though he might agree with it, this wasn't coming from him alone. The
Right.
young people did this, the people did this to try to move this forward. And I think that has to be understood, because as people are now taking up marches and, there's a lot of marches and a lot of protests, it's important. It does go somewhere. It isn't just someone going outside and having a sign up. It matters. It does push things forward.
Speaking of going somewhere, I got to jump off, but you guys keep talking. Luis, good talking to you.
See you later.
See you good.
Luis, I think it's a good point. And also, it might feel impossible to pressure, as an example, Trump. But, right now, somebody like Bernie Sanders, who's still technically in the race, he has a very skeletal immigration plan. And I think he's obviously very progressive. And I think he's very pro-DACA. I don't think that's a question. But there are manifestations or protests can still push the right people in the right direction. Because I've been thinking a lot about DACA and how hard the fight is for such a bullshit benefit, really, if you think about it. On the one hand, it's totally life-changing. I don't mean to underplay that part of it, but it's also ludicrous to live in a country where it's the only country where you formed any memories, as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, every 2 years, you've got to pay at least $500 and take a day off work to go have your fingerprints taken and to go through this sort of humiliation just for the right to work. You don't get to leave the country, which is another weird dichotomy of this whole thing. And so you don't get to vote. You don't get all kinds of things. It doesn't mature into a greater benefit later on. And so people need to realize, one, the importance of fighting for this limited benefit, but then two, the importance of really pushing beyond it, because the limitations are absurd on their face. But I got to run too, and so I'm going to cut this a little bit short. I guess it's not that short, but thanks for coming on. I really appreciate your time, and thanks again for all your hard work on the DACA case.
Absolutely. And if I can just give one quick plug, there's a movie that's coming out. It just came out on Sundance. It's going around making its limited debut before I'm hoping it gets released somewhere. But it's called The Infiltrators. And it's like a documentary style movie about 6 dreamers, right? And this is before DACA, that they all intentionally get detained by immigration. They go to CBP and they go to ICE and they get detained at these detention facilities. And they are activists who go in there and start giving individuals information about how to access counsel and doing a lot of know your rights, but kind of on a very covert level, until ICE picked up on it. And they realized that these people were subjecting themselves to be detained so that they can give information, and essentially placing themselves in removal proceedings to be in the detention center to help a lot of other people get this information. This takes place in 2012, 2013, but the movie's just now coming out now. And it's an incredibly empowering movie about the will of people wanting to help others. So I saw it yesterday. I thought it was amazing. And so I want to give it a quick plug.
Awesome. All right, Luis, have a good weekend and we'll talk to you later.
All right, bro.
Bye.
See you soon.
Cries and whispers from the hall. This time she says she'll leave. The light above the bed is out, but I won't forget the promises you made. Lie your head down, but don't fall asleep. Don't close your eyes. And I know we made some mistakes, baby, and I blame it all on the separate lives that we lead. Whoever's waiting for your call, the man you thought you could believe, it isn't me. Those days have passed and no, I won't regret the last time we met. Lie your head down, but don't fall asleep. Don't close I know we made some mistakes, baby, and I blame it all on the separate lives that we lead. Lie your head down, but don't fall asleep. Don't close your eyes. And I know we made some mistakes, baby, and I blame it all on the separate lives. And I blame it all on the separate lives. And I blame it all on the separate life that we live.